You're lying, Emily. Dad would never say that. Michael Harper's voice thundered through the room, shaking the walls harder than the winter wind outside. The funeral wasn't even over. The scent of lilies still hung heavy in the air. Candles still flickered on the mantel, but the warmth of grief had already turned into something sharp and venomous. Emily Harper stood tall, arms crossed, her eyes cold as glass. He told me himself, she said firmly. This house is mine. Michael slammed his hand on the table, fury burning in his eyes. You're twisting his words to take what isn't yours. Ben Harper, the youngest, stood frozen in the doorway, trapped between two siblings who suddenly looked nothing like family anymore. Outside, snow blanketed the quiet Seattle street. Inside, the framed photo of Robert Harper, their late father, smiled softly, unaware that his death had just ignited a war that would tear his children apart. This wasn't a funeral anymore. It was the first shot fired. Now, let's listen to the story of the Harper family, where pride, love, and betrayal collide, leaving behind a scar that no one would ever forget. The day after the funeral, the Harper house felt different. The flowers wilted, the guests were gone, and what was left behind was silence, the kind that didn't bring peace, but tension. Michael stayed a few extra days to help settle paperwork, while Emily insisted on keeping the house locked until things are sorted. Ben lingered too, though he avoided both of them, moving through the halls as if walking on cracked ice. At first, they tried to stay civil. They shared meals at the kitchen table, exchanged quiet words, avoided eye contact. But every conversation seemed to circle back to the same thing: the house, who it belonged to, who deserved it, and why their father hadn't written anything down. One evening, Emily placed a manila folder on the table. I've already contacted Dad's lawyer, she said calmly. There's no official will, but his finances, his property, everything's manageable. I'll take care of it. Michael looked up from his coffee, his brow tightening. Take care of it, he repeated. You mean take it? Emily sighed, her patience thin. Don't start, Michael. Dad trusted me with his affairs. He said so before he died. Michael interrupted, voice sharp. Funny how no one else heard that but you. Ben looked between them, his hands buried in his hoodie pocket. Can we not do this now? He murmured. But neither of them listened. That was how it began, not with shouting, not with broken dishes, but with distrust that crept in slowly, like rot under the floorboards. Over the next few days, Michael noticed things missing. Keys, documents, the spare deed folder that had always sat in his father's study. Emily claimed she had them for safekeeping. Michael didn't believe her. You're locking me out of my own father's house, he said one afternoon, his tone controlled but dangerous. Emily met his stare without blinking. I'm protecting what's his. You should thank me instead of accusing me. Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're protecting yourself, Emily. Admit it. That was the first time she raised her voice. You think you're the only one who cared about him. You barely visited. I was the one here when he got sick, when he couldn't breathe at night, when the bills piled up. Where were you? Her words cut deep because they were half true. Michael looked away, ashamed for a moment, but then anger replaced guilt. Being there for him doesn't give you ownership. That's not love, Emily. That's control. Ben stood by the doorway, frozen in the middle of their storm, watching the two people he admired most tear into each other like strangers. He wouldn't want this, he said quietly. Dad would hate this. No one answered. That night, Michael packed his things and left the house without saying goodbye. The next morning, Emily changed the locks. By the end of the week, they weren't speaking at all. The once warm Harper home now felt colder than the snow outside. Ben still visited sometimes, dropping off mail or groceries, but he didn't stay long. The silence between his siblings had grown too heavy to bear. From the outside it looked like a family in mourning. But inside, the Harper house had become something else, a place haunted not by death, but by pride, resentment, and words that could never be taken back. And the truth lingered like a whisper in every empty room. Only a week after their father's passing, the Harpers no longer looked at each other as family, they looked at each other as enemies. By the end of that cold January, the Harper siblings were no longer speaking. What began as tense silences had turned into weeks of avoidance, then messages through lawyers, and eventually, through Ben. He had become the unwilling bridge between two people who once finished each other's sentences but now refused to even say each other's names. Michael moved back to his small apartment across town, a cramped two-bedroom he shared with his wife and son. He worked double shifts at the auto shop just to keep up with rent. Every time he looked at his father's old house on Maple Street, a sharp ache ran through him. That place had been their childhood. Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues, the smell of their dad's coffee on Sunday mornings. Now it felt like a monument stolen from him. Emily, meanwhile, continued her life without pause. Her real estate business was thriving. Her husband had just bought a new SUV. From the outside, she looked composed, the picture of a woman who had moved on, but inside, something in her had hardened. Every time she saw Michael's name flash on her phone, she rolled her eyes. He'll never change, she'd think, always the victim. When Michael first tried to call, she didn't answer. The next time he texted, "You can't just lock me out of Dad's life like that." She replied hours later, "Dad's life is over, Michael. Try to accept it." Ben watched the messages pile up on both their phones. He'd stop by Emily's place to drop off mail or visit his nephews, and she'd always ask casually, "Have you heard from your brother?" Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of tension, a mixture of annoyance and guilt she refused to name. Michael, on the other hand, spoke of Emily as if she were a stranger. Over beer one night, he told Ben, "She thinks money makes her right. She's forgotten what family even means." His hands were dirty with grease, his face tired. "I'm not letting her erase me. Not from his memory. Not from that house." Ben wanted to tell him to let it go, but he knew it was too late. Pride had already dug its claws into both of them. Weeks passed, and letters from the city started arriving at Michael's apartment, unpaid property taxes, overdue maintenance fees on the old house. His name was still listed as He took the notice, folded it neatly, and drove to Emily's neighborhood, the kind with clean sidewalks and expensive silence. When she opened the door, her expression didn't change. "Michael," she greeted, clipped and cold. "We need to talk," he said, holding up the notice. "You've ignored this for months. If you don't pay, they'll fine both of us." Emily crossed her arms. "And why is that my responsibility? You're the one still clinging to that place." "It's our place," he shot back. Her laugh was quiet, sharp. "No, Michael. It's a decaying house that's ruining your life. You think Dad would want you throwing your paycheck at a building he barely maintained? You wouldn't understand," he said bitterly. "You didn't grow up in those walls. You left as soon as you could. I built a life, Michael, something you never did. Maybe that's the real problem here. You can't stand that I moved forward and you didn't." He stared at her, jaw tight. "You can call it success. I call it selfishness." Her tone dropped, cutting like ice. "And I call yours jealousy." The argument lasted less than 5 minutes, but it hung in the air for months. Michael stormed out, the sound of the front door slamming echoing down her perfect street. Emily stood there in the doorway, breathing hard, her fingers trembling despite the smugness on her face. After that, they didn't see each other again, but the war continued from afar. Emily started forwarding legal documents through her lawyer, demanding sole ownership. Michael began showing up at the old house on weekends, mowing the lawn, fixing broken windows, to prove it still mattered. He poured every spare dollar into keeping it standing, as if keeping the walls upright could somehow hold his family together. Ben visited once and found him sitting on the porch steps, hands blackened from engine oil, eyes distant. "You can't fix what's already gone, Mike," he said gently. Michael didn't look at him. "I'm not fixing it," he murmured. "I'm fighting for it." Emily, meanwhile, told friends and relatives that Michael had lost it, that grief had made him obsessive. She said it with a rehearsed sigh, like she was the one suffering. People believed her. She was articulate, successful, calm, while Michael was angry, tired, and broke. Ben tried to reason with both, but it was like standing between two fires. Every word he carried from one side to the other came back twisted, burned. "Tell her she can have the house," Michael would say one night, only to call the next day furious. "No, don't. Let her fight for it." Through it all, winter dragged on. Snow melted into slush, then froze again. The Harper house stood empty most days, its windows dark, its heart colder than ever. And from the outside, it still looked like an old family home, but for those who knew the truth, it had become something else entirely, a battlefield dressed as a memory. Ben would later say, "I just stood in the middle, listening to them talk about each other like enemies, and realizing that maybe they already were." By early spring, things between the Harpers had gone from tense to combustible. What had once been a quiet legal dispute had turned personal, mean, vindictive, and raw. Michael had stopped answering Emily's emails. She'd stopped pretending to be polite, and Ben, who once tried to mediate, now avoided both entirely. The breaking point came in March. Michael had just finished another double shift at the auto shop when a letter arrived taped to his apartment door. It was from Emily's lawyer, an eviction notice stating that he was illegally occupying their late father's property. The house he'd been maintaining, cleaning, and paying taxes on was suddenly being treated as evidence against him. He stood in the hallway for a long time, the letter shaking in his hands. His wife asked him to sit, to breathe, but all he could say was, "She's trying to erase me." The next morning, he drove to the old Harper house. The snow had melted, revealing dead grass and peeling paint, but to him, it still looked alive, his father's voice lingering somewhere inside those walls. He opened the door with his spare key and stepped inside. The air stale and heavy. He unpacked a small bag, set it on the dusty couch, and whispered, almost to himself, "I'm home." That night he moved in. Emily found out 2 days later when her realtor called, saying someone had been seen inside the property. She didn't even hesitate. She called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Michael sitting in the living room, the lights dim, a half-empty beer beside him. He didn't resist when they asked him to leave. He just looked at them and said quietly, "This is my father's house. I'm not trespassing." They escorted him out anyway. Emily arrived minutes later, her car headlights slicing through the dark. She stepped out in heels and a tailored coat, her face pale with anger. "What the hell are you doing, Michael?" she demanded. "Are you really breaking into Dad's house now?" He stared at her, tired and hollow. "Breaking in? I'm keeping it alive. You've left it to rot. This isn't about the house," she shouted. "It's about you refusing to move on." He took a step closer, his voice low but sharp. "No, Emily, it's about you pretending you care about family when you only care about control." For a long second, neither spoke. Their breath misted in the cold air. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, breaking the silence. Finally, Emily turned away, eyes wet though she wouldn't admit it. "You need help," she muttered, "and I'm done trying to reason with you." She walked back to her car and drove off, the red taillights fading into the night. Michael stood there on the porch, the eviction notice still in his pocket, watching the snow begin to fall again, small flakes catching in his hair, melting against his skin. The world around him was quiet, too quiet. He looked at the dark house one last time, the place that once felt like love, now standing as proof of everything he'd lost. And for the first time, even he couldn't tell whether he was fighting for his father's memory or just refusing to accept that it was already gone. After that night on the porch, nothing between the Harpers was ever the same. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was exhaustion, a kind of emotional fog that settled over everything, blurring the edges of who they used to be. Michael moved back into his apartment, but he wasn't really there. He spent his nights driving past the old house, headlights cutting through the fog, watching the windows like a man haunting his own memories. His wife stopped asking him to come to dinner. His son stopped waiting for him to show up at school games. Bills piled up. His job at the auto shop started slipping. He'd forget tasks, lose focus. "You okay, Mike?" his boss asked one day. He just nodded, though his hands were trembling. The fight over the house had consumed him. What used to be pride now felt like poison in his veins. Emily, meanwhile, won the legal battle. The court granted her full ownership, citing her financial stability and role as executor of their father's estate. She smiled when the lawyer called, a polite, professional smile, but it faded before she even hung up the phone. She drove to the house a week later, expecting victory to feel sweet. Instead, she stood in the doorway, looking around at the cracked walls and peeling paint, and felt something hollow instead. The air was still thick with the scent of old wood and dust, the same smell from their childhood, the same sound of wind pushing through broken windows. For a moment, she thought she heard her father's cough echo faintly from down the hall. She blinked hard, stepped outside, and locked the door again. Ben was the only one who still tried to keep the peace. He'd call them both occasionally, short, polite conversations that always ended in silence. When he visited Michael, he'd find the apartment cluttered with unpaid bills, empty beer bottles, and old photos scattered across the counter. "You should let it go," Ben said softly one night. "It's over." Michael looked up from the photo in his hands, one of him, Emily, and their dad standing on that same porch, smiling in the summer sun. "That's the problem," he said. "It's not over, not for me." Ben didn't argue. He'd seen that look before, the one that said Michael wasn't fighting anyone anymore but himself. As for Emily, her success began to feel like a mask. She threw herself into work, closing deals, smiling at clients, but every night she'd come home to a spotless house that felt colder than any winter. Her husband noticed the change. "You got what you wanted," he told her once. "So why do you look like you lost everything?" She didn't answer. She just stared out the window, where snow was falling again. Months passed. The Harper house sat empty. No laughter, no lights, just silence. The city sent letters about overdue repairs, threatening fines. Emily ignored them at first, then paid them without thinking. like a reflex. She could afford the bills, but she couldn't afford the memories. Michael stopped by once, in early winter. He didn't go inside. He stood by the gate, looking through the frost-covered glass at the place that had defined his pain. The windows were boarded, the mailbox overflowing. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a tomb, he whispered, something under his breath, maybe an apology, maybe a farewell, then turned and walked away. That night, Emily drove by too, unaware that her brother had been there hours before. She parked across the street, engine idling, watching her breath fog up the glass. She thought about knocking on the door, maybe even fixing it up again, but she didn't move. She just sat there, staring, until the cold crept into her bones. And Ben, he was the only one who still visited their father's grave. He'd stand there, brush the snow off the headstone, and think about how proud their dad used to be of his children. Then he'd sigh and whisper, "You wouldn't have wanted this, would you?" Sometimes he'd glance back toward Maple Street, where the house stood dark against the gray sky, and wonder if some part of their father still lingered there, not as a ghost, but as the weight of everything they couldn't forgive. That winter, Seattle felt colder than usual, and in 3 different homes across the city, the Harpers, once bound by love, sat in silence, each haunted by the same truth. They had all won something, and lost everything that mattered. Spring returned to Seattle quietly that year. Gray skies, wet sidewalks, and a chill that lingered longer than it should have. For months, the Harper house had remained empty, a hollow monument to a family that no longer spoke. But one April morning, a small for sale sign appeared in the front yard. Emily had made her decision. When Michael saw it, he froze. He had been driving by on his way to work, coffee in hand, half awake, when the red and white letters caught his eye. He pulled over, sat there for a long time, watching the wind twist the sign back and forth. Then he got out of the truck. The grass was overgrown, brittle under his boots. He walked to the porch, reached out, and ran his fingers along the railing, the one he and Ben used to paint every summer. A streak of old white flaked off under his touch. For a moment, he could almost hear his father's voice, calm and steady, telling him to keep the coat even. He swallowed hard. Emily was inside. She turned when she heard the door creak. The sight of him there, tired, older, yet still stubborn, froze her in place. Neither spoke at first. Then, softly, Michael said, "You're selling it." "I have to," she replied. "It's time to move on." He let out a short, broken laugh. "Move on," he repeated, almost to himself. "You say that like it's easy." "Maybe it should have been," she said, her voice flat. "But we made it harder than it ever had to be." Michael looked around the dusty furniture, the empty walls, the faint scent of wood polish still clinging to the air. "This place," he murmured, "it used to mean something. It was home." Emily's gaze softened, just a little. "It still can be, Michael, just not for us." They stood there in silence, the kind that felt like a goodbye years overdue. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows. Finally, Michael nodded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded envelope, the last property tax bill he'd paid months ago, long before the court ruling. He placed it on the table. "Keep it," he said quietly. "I'm done fighting." Emily hesitated, then whispered, "So am I." He took one last look at the living room, the old couch, the faded curtains, the spot where their father's chair used to be. Every piece of it was a memory, but none of it felt alive anymore. When he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway, his hand resting against the wall. The paint was cold beneath his palm, the texture rough. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the silence, a silence that wasn't angry anymore, just empty. "Goodbye, Dad," he said under his breath, barely audible. Then he stepped outside. Emily followed him to the porch. She didn't call after him, didn't try to stop him. She only watched as he walked down the path, shoulders heavy but steps steady, like a man finally laying down a burden he'd carried too long. When he reached his truck, he turned back once. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, there was no anger between them, only weariness, and a quiet understanding that some battles aren't meant to be won, only survived. As he drove away, Emily stood alone in the doorway. Behind her, the house creaked softly, as if exhaling after years of holding its breath, and in that stillness it felt as though every ghost, their fathers, their childhoods, their prides, had finally gone quiet. Weeks after the sale, the Harper house stood empty once more. The windows were bare, the furniture gone, and the walls carried faint outlines of where family photos used to hang. By the time the moving truck pulled away, there was nothing left to show that a family had ever lived there except the Faint smell of coffee soaked into the floorboards. Emily watched from the sidewalk as the new owners arrived, a young couple with 2 kids, full of laughter. They carried boxes and hope through the same doorway where she and her brothers had last stood in silence. For a fleeting moment she almost smiled. Maybe the house would finally hold warmth again. Maybe it was meant to belong to someone untouched by their ghosts. She turned and left without looking back. Her life moved on, new listings, business meetings, small talk that meant nothing. But every now and then, when she passed through Maple Street, she'd slow down just a little, her eyes searching for the porch light that was no longer hers. Success hadn't made her proud anymore. It only reminded her how empty winning could feel. Michael never went back. After that final day, he stopped driving by, stopped talking about the house altogether. He focused on fixing cars, on rebuilding trust with his family, one small apology at a time. But something in him had dimmed a quiet weariness that showed in his eyes. The fight had burned through everything, and when the ashes settled, he realized he'd been standing alone in the fire. Ben stayed the same, the quiet middle ground that had learned too much about pride and loss. Sometimes, when he visited their father's grave, he'd bring a flower for each of them, one for the brother who couldn't let go, and one for the sister who couldn't feel. Standing there in the cold wind, he'd whisper, "It's over now, Dad. I think they've finally learned." But deep down, he knew that what they'd learned came too late, because in the end, there were no winners, just lessons carved into silence. The Harper house had been sold, the papers signed, the memories boxed and buried, yet the echoes remained. And as Ben walked away from the graveyard, he thought to himself, maybe in family wars, no one really wins. There's only loss and the quiet that follows sometimes. The things we hold on to the tightest, the things we swear we can't live without, are the very things that end up breaking us. The Harpers fought for a house, but it was never really about bricks or walls. It was about love that turned into pride, about a family that forgot how to forgive, and in the end, pride cost them more than any court ruling ever could. Maybe that's the quiet truth hidden in so many families, that we only realize the weight of what we've lost when it's far too late to set it down. If there's one lesson in the Harper family's story, it's this: letting go isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the only way to save what's left. Thank you for listening until the very end. If you've ever witnessed a story like this one where love and pride collided, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you think, and if this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because every week, we tell more stories just like this, stories of ordinary lives, quiet choices, and the moments that change everything. Stories that remind us, even the most ordinary families can hold the most extraordinary heartbreaks.